So I've been working on a monster raising RPG inspired by the classics like Monster Rancher and Digimon World for the PS1. And I wanted to start documenting the process just a bit more. Partly so I can look back on it, but also because maybe someone out there will find this useful. Or it might encourage someone to get into game development themselves. Because making a full game can feel pretty overwhelming, and honestly it is. But that's kind of why it helps to break it down into much smaller, more manageable pieces. Like if you're making a model in Blender, which I've been learning alongside Unreal Engine, you don't just make the whole thing at once. You build it step by step. And I think the same idea applies very well to game development. Every system is just one small part, and over time those parts come together. I think they say every day is a school day. This project definitely feels like that. Instead of just showing what I made, I want to go through how I built each system, what went wrong, and how I ended up fixing it. Because almost nothing worked right the first time. So I started with something simple, just basic player movement. It should be easy, but immediately wasn't. I was using Unreal's enhanced input system and ran into an issue where movement just didn't behave correctly or wouldn't respond, especially working with the scalar values. Everything looked right, but the character just wasn't moving. So I tried to approach from a different angle, and I made sure I was passing clean directional values directly into movement. And once that clicked, everything started working properly. It's one of those cases where Unreal gives you a powerful system, but if you overcomplicate it early, it just becomes a pain to debug. After that, I moved on to the partner, which is basically the core of the whole game. I didn't want it just to be another character, so instead of tying it to the player, I made it its own actor with its own component and logic. Right now, it follows the player using simple distance check, and if you get too far, it moves towards you. If it gets too close, it stops, which works surprisingly well. One issue I did run into is that it can sometimes walk directly into the player or an enemy and get stuck. Although it hasn't happened too often, for now I've just turned off collision with the player to avoid that. And I'll probably add some proper handling for enemy collision later. You could build this with AI move to or behavior trees, but honestly, a simple follow system works really well for this kind of game. Once I had the player and the partner moving around, I needed a way to control how the game actually looks, especially when switching between exploration and combat. So I set up a camera manager. The main goal here was to switch to a more locked camera when entering battle and then return to a follow camera when the fight ends. I've done camera trigger setups before in an older project, but I don't want to get too deep into that since that's not really the focus of this video. Right now, I'm still not completely sure how I want the exploration camera to behave long term, but having the system in place gives me a solid foundation to build on. Once that was working, I needed a way to store actual data for the partner. So I built a stat system. And instead of putting everything directly onto the character, I used a stat component paired with data asset. So each monster has a base data that initializes runtime stats, which makes it really easy to reuse and expand. You can store everything directly on the character or use a struct or even something like the gameplay ability system. But for this kind of game, I think component setup is simple and flexible. Then I moved to the need system, which is where the game really starts to feel like Digimon World. The partner tracks things like hunger, fatigue, bathroom, happiness, and discipline, and these values update over time and influence behavior. I put all these into a separate needs component so it doesn't get mixed up with the stats, which makes it much easier to manage. And yes, the bathroom system exists. I'm not explaining why, it just has to be done. To support that, I added a time system with a simple day night cycle. At first, I tried to rotate a directional light to fake the sun based on in game time, but I couldn't quite get it to look right. When I started pointing the light upwards, it would light the underside of the model, while everything else was dark, which just looked wrong. I tried to clamp the rotation so it would never point up, and that did help a bit, but it still felt very inconsistent. In the end, I switched to using preset lighting values for different times of the day instead, which gave me a lot more control and, in my opinion, looks much better. It's a simpler approach, but it fits the style I'm going for. Another thing I added was the basic interaction interface. It's pretty simple at the moment, but it lets the player interact with things in the world, like training equipment or a bathroom. For example, there's a training actor where you can increase your stats, but it also builds up fatigue on the partner. At first, I had it so that the partner would just fall asleep when fatigue was too high, but that didn't really make sense with what I wanted long term, since I planned to give each species its own active hours and sleep schedule. So instead, I moved it to be more tied to the world time system. I added a bathroom interaction where the partner can go when they need it, if you can make it in there in time, that is. Otherwise, you're left dealing with the consequences. It's still very basic, but it ties nicely into the need system, and it makes the world feel a bit more interactive. Once I had it all working, I finally needed something for the partner to interact with. So I created a basic enemy blueprint. Up until this point, the partner was just basically following the player around. So adding enemies was the first step towards actual gameplay. Right now, the enemy works pretty similar to the partner, but instead of following the player, it wanders to a random point in the world. And if you get too close, it will move towards the player to start battle. It's a simple setup, but it works well for testing. Later on, I want to expand this so enemies have a more defined behavior, like noticing the player from a distance and deciding whether to engage on something like aggression. Before putting the full battle system together, I need a way for both the partner and the enemies to actually make decisions. So I built a simple brain component. This is what controls what they do during combat. It keeps track of things like aggression, discipline, and attack cooldown, and then uses that to decide what action to take. From there, it picks from a list of available techniques based on things like mana and distance to the target, and also determines if or how often it should defend instead of attacking. It's pretty lightweight, but it already makes battles feel a lot less scripted and more unpredictable. After that, I built a battle manager, which handles pretty much everything during a fight. When the player bumps into an enemy, it calls the battle manager, which sets up the battle by putting a barrier around and telling both player and the enemy that they're now in combat. It then switches over to a battle rig and starts managing the flow of the fight. That includes things like calculating damage by comparing attack and defense values, checking if the character is defending and how much damage should be reduced, and whether to apply things like knockback. It also handles what happens after the fight ends, like whether you win or lose, any rewards such as stat growth or items. It ended up being the main central place where all combat logic lives, which made things a lot easier to manage. Another thing I added was the ability to flee from combat. This is based on speed values, where the game rolls a chance to see if you can escape. If the attempt fails, it currently reduces the partner's unhappiness, which works for now, although I think I'll replace it with something that makes more sense later. I also added a simple tactics system so the player can influence how the partner behaves during battle. Right now, you can switch between options like auto, melee, and range, which decides how the partner chooses its action. It's pretty basic, but it already gives you more control without directly controlling the monster. Later, I want to add and expand this with more options like defending, keeping distance. After getting battles working, the inventory system started to make a lot more sense. I wanted it to feel closer to the older RPGs, so instead of a dynamic list, I used a fixed layout of 20 slots in two columns. And the key idea is that the UI is fixed, but the data isn't. So the inventory array can be any size, but the UI only shows the same structure. I did run into an issue where empty slots were not showing up at all, which turned out to be a UI problem rather than a logic problem. And fixing it mostly came down to forcing the slot size and making sure every slots get created properly. Then I added items, which are handled through data assets that define their effect and usage. When you use an item, it checks whether you're in battle or not, then checks discipline, then applies the effect outside of battle. The partner can actually refuse to use the item depending on their discipline, which I implemented as a simple random roll. So when you try to help your monster, it can completely refuse you, which honestly adds personality. And without that, the partner would just be a tool instead of something alive. So that's where the project is right now. The systems are starting to connect, and it's finally feeling a little bit more than just a prototype. Next, I want to expand the world, add more monsters, build training areas, and really push the partner behavior so it feels more alive and reactive. If you played Digimon World growing up, I'd love to see what systems you'd like to see in this. And if you're building something similar, hopefully this gives you some ideas. Thanks for watching.